Hi, Misha here, and last time when we looked at British tanks, we talked about one of the best, most famousest, and most combat-proven tanks of the Cold War era. Although it started off in World War II, the Centurion, and just barely missed being in the war, at least firing shots in anger. This was developed as a heavy cruiser and arguably became a universal tank, a main battle tank. It had initially a 17-pounder gun, then a 20-pounder, and then towards the end, some of them were upgraded with a 105, the L7. But this was the mainstay of Britain and purchased by dozens of nations and saw combat literally all around the world. This one here is from the Suez Crisis. They also saw combat in Korea, Vietnam. It was an impressive tank, around 51 tons, but it wasn't especially fast, although it was maneuverable. And its armor, while very good for the day it was made in, they were worried it couldn't stand up to newer Russian guns in the over 100 millimeter range, 125 millimeter type gun, not to mention anti-tank missiles which are coming into use. In response, Britain developed the Conqueror tank, which was still a heavy tank, what they would have referred to in the past as an infantry tank. It had a new 120 millimeter gun, essentially an L11 type, and it had thick armor. But it was slow, big, and they only built about 60, and they only ever were used in West Germany. What they really wanted was a tank that combined the best features, the usefulness, the versatility of the Centurion with the heavy armor and heavy gun of the Conqueror. Enter the Leyland Chieftain, which should have been a great, famous tank, but really it served for less than 2 decades. And its only real combat was mediocre, to say the least. That said, they did build over 1,800, so not exactly a short production run. And it is a development and evolution of the Centurion, as I'm sure you can tell here. So let's dive in. Work on this tank began in the mid-50s, around 56, 57. And it was to be an uprated Centurion, initially known as FV-4202. Essentially, it had the gun from the Conqueror, and it had a new drive system and suspension system, improved transmission, and while it might sound kind of funny, it had a new seating arrangement for the driver where he was kind of reclined. Think of like an F-16 cockpit where it semi-reclined back. The reason I say that might seem funny, well, I don't know, I have this image of a British guy in like a lazy boy. But this was good because it allowed the tank to be a little bit shorter, but really it allowed for much greater sloping of the front plate and the armor. And so even though it had 120 millimeter front plate, effectively because of the sloping, it was equivalent to nearly 400 millimeters of armor. And the turret too was well protected with sloping armor. And originally they were shooting for 45 tons, but of course this would quickly grow, as we'll see, nearly to 55 tons by the final version, which this is a Mark V here. Most ended up being that. Another thing, NATO had this brilliant idea that all their tanks should have multi-fuel engines. So in the advent of war, They can run them on anything. Fun story. We were heading down to Texas back in November to get those guns from JDI, and there was one of those trucks burning recycled, like, deep fryer fluid, essentially. And oh my god, it smelled terrible. I knew it was gagging. It smelled like the rancidest McDonald's, where they needed to change the fryer, and they didn't, and they were burning it. Oh my god, it was terrible. This would end up evolving into the Leyland L60 engine. It could run off many types of fuel. That was about its only asset. The initial version was not reliable, was not efficient, and was generally speaking a pain in the ass, and probably smelled bad when burning. And in any event, they never really did anything from normal petrol anyway. But they didn't know war, all that good stuff. So essentially they have a new, very heavily sloped front armor, enhanced sloping to other armor. They have the Conqueror's 120 millimeter gun. First it was an L11A1, soon it would be upgraded to the A2 and A3. It actually used a two-part charge. It had a bullet and then a charge pack behind it that was loaded. And this is really when the British love of the HESH round, the high explosive squash head, comes in. They also had armor piercing with a discarding sabot, and a few other charges. It's pretty versatile. It could carry about 60 to 65 rounds, and this two-part type really let it be efficient. It also had a coax machine gun, 7.62 millimeter, either an L7 or an L8, and on the top it had a Hatch machine gun. It was also 7.62, and initially it had a 50 caliber, 12.7 millimeter ranging machine gun, as we've seen in the later versions of the Centurion. Although this wouldn't last forever as technology would progress on. It was slightly faster than the Centurion. The first versions got up to about 25, 26 miles per hour on the road. One thing it did have, it had much greater range than the Centurion, but that's not saying much. Everything does. And overall, it was about the same hull length and everything we've been dealing with, about 25 feet, with the gun forward closer to 35 feet. Standard crew of 4, 1 driver in the hull, and then the other 3 in the turret. We do have a new turret design. And this all kind of goes back to that prototype. The turret was an early version. It would be carried over, and they would continue to modify the Centurion hull. And the earliest kind of concept for field trial stuff came out in 1959. These weren't Chieftains yet, but getting there, getting closer. And actually, around this time, the Israelis get involved. The Israelis started fielding the Centurion in 1959. Afterwards, they get involved at late stage with the UK because they planned on adopting it. So they really helped them tweak it for better operation in the desert and other arid, harsh environments. They also helped it with the hull down position for fighting, because the Israelis had some experience with this, more than the Brits at the time. Just, kind of being a sounding board and a testing board. So it looked like there would kind of be a joint thing between the British and the Israelis to make this happen. Budgets in testing and the fact that it was more or less peacetime meant that the 60s they had time to kind of tweak it and go with it. And that engine, that L60, they were having problems with. They had to kind of keep going back to the drawing board a few times and trying to get it to run right. The first tanks came out. They were the Chieftain Mark I in 1965. And this was a pretty short-lived model, and it was actually not fully combat capable. They were really only for field testing and trials and for training, practice, that kind of thing. Now, the first fully combat capable version would appear in 1967. That would be the Mark II, because 2 comes after 1. The Mark II first was entered into field service in 1967 in West Germany. It had several important improvements, including it had a nuclear biological protection system, NBC. The Centurion did not have this, so in a way they were behind the Soviets. It also would have an improved L-11 gun, first the A2, then the A3. It would have some improvements to the engine, things of that nature. It had a stabilized gun and a computer system for it, the first analog, later digital. Now the Mark III was introduced in 1969, and it would have more improvements to the engine, trying to get it to run halfway decently. They would advance different versions of the gun. It was a little faster. It could get up to 30 miles per hour on road, had a little better endurance. At this point, the tank's up to about 53, 54 tons. These still have the ranging gun, the 50 caliber, but this would soon give way to infrared systems. And in 1975, the ultimate version, the Mark V, would come out, and it would have a new version of the engine again, which finally did reach quite good reliability. And they would advance to the A6 and A7 version of the main gun, increase the ammunition. They would introduce a more modern computer system, so on and so forth. Also, at the same time, they started the program known as Totem Pole. This was to upgrade older Mark IIs and Mark IIIs to the Mark V standards. The Mark Is, they didn't worry about it. In fact, they would just retire them. They would do these in stages, and the most important thing to come out of this was TOGS. It was a thermal imaging system for targeting the gun, and this let them get rid of the 50 caliber. And TOGS would appear, still does today, on the Challengers. And by 1979, the upgrade to the fleet was done. The British military would acquire about 900, and about 950 were slated for export. Now, the last major round of improvements came in 84 to 86, when they started installing Stillbrew armor on these. That was to let them counter the latest Soviet guns and anti-tank missiles. That was the whole point of this, was to have better endurance and to be able to go up against the latest Soviet stuff, operate at medium, long ranges, and just take a hit better and deliver. They were planning to go further with the Chieftain in the UK, but as any evidence, the Challenger 1 would kind of come out of nowhere and go into service instead. So, yeah, they would discontinue it there. The British never really used this in combat to speak of, and they would be retired out starting in the mid-late 80s, with the final, at least, tank versions retired by 1995. But it would see combat, actually quite a bit of it, but it would be down in the Middle East. Now you might think Israel, and they did make 2 pre-production models under the Mark IV name for Israel, and they did test them. However, the political situation between the UK and Israel in the mid-60s was not great. And since the UK was pretty close with a lot of Arab nations, in the case of this, namely Jordan, they decided to not go with the Israeli deal, cutting them out, canceling the contract. Now, the Israelis would use the 2 Mark IVs they had to help develop their next generation of main battle tanks, but that's a story for another video. The biggest purchaser in the Middle East was probably Iran. Kuwait, Jordan also purchased some. Quite a large number. And of course, when the Shah would fall, the new government would inherit these in Iran. And they would have nearly 900 at the start of the war with Iraq. And they would go up against Iraqi T-72s, as well as other Soviet tanks. And they didn't do so well. They started with nearly 900. They ended the war with around 200. The Iraqis would capture some chieftains, and they would test them, and they were not impressed, to say the least. It has to be said that Kuwait had about 140 in 1990 when Iraq would invade them. And there, in Kuwaiti hands, they would do better. It was obviously just a delaying action because Iraq was going to steamroll them. But they didn't lose any in combat, and they did hold up Iraqi tanks. So it kind of showed that maybe the problem wasn't so much the chieftains themselves as the people piloting them. Who knows? That was pretty much it, though. Again, not a lot of combat. It was kind of one of those awkward in-between tanks in a lot of ways. Not a bad one, but it was hampered by the L-60 engine. Had a good main gun, the L-11. In fact, it's basically what they still use today. And the armor was very effective. The turret was well protected. The glacis plate is quite thick. Again, it was NBC protected. It had TOGs, at least later on. It had a digital computer for the gun. The Steel-Bru armor was actually quite good for the 1980s. So it wasn't a bad design. By the way, towards the end, with the Mark V, especially the improved ones with Steel-Bru, the weight had grown to about 55 tons, 54 to be sure. But it, at the end of the day, was essentially an upgraded Centurion, and there was only so far they could take that. Yep, typical model of mine, 132 die-cast. The hull's all metal. Turret here is plastic because of how much detailing and stuff's going on. Got the guns. Gun does move. Rubber tracks. Pretty much all the service ones are updated to Mark V standard. Again, the Mark Is were retired out. But this was just a step on the road. So next time, we will talk about Challenger. The first Challenger. Shall we call him Senior? Who knows? With that, if you could, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.